The early morning light painted the Montana sky in soft shades of pink and orange, casting a golden glow over the quiet countryside. The town of Willow Creek, nestled deep in the heart of the state, was the kind of place where time moved a little slower. Life here was simple, just the way Henry Lawson preferred it. At 76 years old, Henry had long since settled into a predictable routine. Every morning, he'd rise before the sun, brew a strong cup of black coffee, and sit out on his porch, wrapped in a thick flannel jacket, watching the world wake up. His small wooden house, perched at the edge of a vast forest, had been his home for over 40 years. Once, it had been filled with laughter, his wife's warm chuckles, his daughter's chatter, and the tiny footsteps of his granddaughter, Emily. But those days were long gone. Now, the only sounds were the distant call of birds and the rustling of trees swaying in the crisp morning breeze. Henry took a slow sip of coffee, his weathered hands gripping the mug. His deep-set blue eyes, framed by lines of time and wisdom, stared off into the distance. He didn't mind the silence, or at least, that's what he told himself. After his wife passed and his daughter moved away with Emily, he had grown used to being alone. But sometimes, on mornings like this, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was missing. That's when he heard it. A soft rustling near the edge of his porch. At first, Henry assumed it was just the wind or a squirrel scurrying through the grass. But then he saw it, a small, scruffy cat stepping cautiously into the sunlight. She was thin, her gray fur matted and unkempt, but her vivid green eyes gleamed with a quiet intelligence. She wasn't a wild cat, Henry could tell that much. No, this little thing had known a home once. The cat stopped a few feet away, staring at him with an intensity that sent a shiver up his spine. There was something oddly familiar about her. "Where'd you come from, huh?" Henry murmured, setting his mug down. The cat tilted her head, her tail curling around her paws, as if she were studying him just as much as he was studying her. Henry shook his head and stood. He wasn't in the habit of taking in strays. Life had already taught him that people and animals came and went. He'd stopped getting attached a long time ago. But as he turned to go back inside, he heard a small, broken sound, a soft meow, barely more than a whisper. Something in Henry's chest tightened. With a sigh, he stepped forward and held out a hand. "Well, I guess a little food won't hurt." And just like that, fate set something in motion, something neither Henry nor the cat could have ever expected. Henry stood at the threshold of his house, watching as the scruffy gray cat eyed him with quiet curiosity. She didn't run, but she didn't come closer either. It was as if she was deciding whether or not to trust him. With a sigh, Henry rubbed the back of his neck. All right. Stay if you want, but I'm not running a cat hotel." He stepped inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. A few minutes later, he set down a small saucer of warm milk and a slice of leftover fish from last night's dinner. He told himself he was only being practical. A hungry cat wouldn't survive long out here, not with the coyotes roaming the woods. The cat hesitated before finally stepping forward, cautiously sniffing the meal. Then, as if she'd decided Henry was no threat, she devoured it in seconds. Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess you were starving, huh?" She licked her whiskers, then looked up at him with those bright green eyes, as if silently thanking him. Over the next few days, the cat lingered around the house. She never strayed too far, always appearing near the porch in the mornings, waiting for Henry to step outside with his coffee. He pretended not to notice at first, convincing himself that she'd eventually move on. But she never did. One rainy evening, as the wind howled through the trees, Henry found himself standing by the door, debating. The cat was out there, huddled under the porch, trying to stay dry. "Damn it," Henry muttered under his breath before opening the door. He stepped outside, his boots creaking on the wooden floorboards. The cat lifted her head but didn't move. "You coming in or what?" For a moment, she just stared at him. Then, as if making up her mind, she gracefully trotted inside. Henry sighed, shutting the door behind them. "Guess I've got a houseguest now." The next morning, Henry sat at the kitchen table, watching as the cat curled up near the wood-burning stove. "I suppose I should call you something," he mused aloud. "Can't just keep saying, 'Hey, cat,' all the time." The cat opened one green eye, stretching lazily. Henry studied her. Her fur was still patchy from weeks, maybe months, of living outdoors, but her whiskers were long and striking, standing out against her gray face. "How about whiskers?" The cat flicked her tail but didn't protest. Henry took that as a sign of approval. "Well, Whiskers, looks like you've made yourself at home." Over the following weeks, Henry found himself falling into a routine with Whiskers. She would wake him up before sunrise, softly pawing at the edge of his bed. She followed him to the porch every morning, watching the birds as he sipped his coffee. When he read his newspaper, she curled up beside him on the couch, her gentle purring filling the otherwise quiet house. And at night, when the loneliness crept in, when the house felt too big and too empty, Whiskers would curl up at his feet, a small, warm presence that made the silence feel a little less heavy. Henry hadn't realized how much he'd missed having company. But then, strange things began happening. One evening, as Henry sat by the fireplace, Whiskers suddenly jumped onto the mantel, knocking over a few old picture frames. "Hey, what's gotten into you?" Henry grumbled, reaching for the scattered frames. He picked up an old photograph of his granddaughter, Emily, when she was around 10 years old. She was laughing, holding a fluffy gray kitten in her arms, a kitten that looked exactly like Whiskers. Henry's breath caught. He squinted at the photo, then at the cat sitting on the mantel. It couldn't be. Could it? "Daisy," he murmured. The cat's ears perked up at the name. Henry shook his head. No, it had to be a coincidence. It had been 12 years since Emily's cat, Daisy, had disappeared. The chances of this being the same cat were impossible. And yet, Whiskers acted like she knew this house. She had walked in like she belonged, settling into a routine as if she had lived here before. Henry set the picture down, rubbing his temples. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself. "You're just a stray, aren't you?" But doubt had already crept in. The past, it seemed, had a way of finding its way back home. Henry tried to shake the thought from his mind. It was ridiculous, completely impossible. The cat curled up near his feet couldn't be Daisy, Emily's long-lost pet from over a decade ago. And yet, as the days passed, Whiskers' behavior only deepened the mystery. One night, Henry found himself dozing off in his recliner, a blanket draped over his lap, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Half asleep, he barely registered the small weight that jumped onto the armrest. Then, he felt the soft nudge of a furry head against his hand. Instinctively, he reached out and scratched behind her ears. A purring sound rumbled against his palm. It was so familiar. He opened his eyes and watched as Whiskers curled into a perfect ball on his lap, her tiny paws tucked beneath her chest. A wave of déjà vu hit him. This exact moment had happened before. Years ago, on a winter evening just like this, Daisy had done the same thing, curled up in his lap, purring like a tiny motor. His heart skipped a beat. Over the next few weeks, Whiskers continued to surprise him. She knew her way around the house as if she had lived there before. She preferred Emily's old room, often curling up on the window seat where Emily used to read books. She avoided the basement, just like Daisy had when she was a kitten. The realization gnawed at Henry in quiet moments. Late at night, when the house was still and the fire burned low, he found himself staring at Whiskers, watching how she moved, how she stretched, how she gazed at him with those deep green eyes. What if? It was a foolish thought, but Henry couldn't shake it. One afternoon, as he sorted through some old boxes in the attic, he stumbled upon an old collar. His breath caught. It was Daisy's collar. The fabric was worn, the tiny silver tag slightly rusted, but when he turned it over, the engraving was still clear. Daisy, Emily's best friend. Henry stared at it for a long time. That night, Henry sat at the kitchen table, the old collar resting in his palm. Whiskers jumped onto the table, her tail flicking back and forth as she studied him. "All right," Henry murmured, "let's see something." Gently, he reached out and slipped Daisy's old collar around Whiskers' neck. It fit perfectly. Whiskers froze, her ears twitching slightly. She lifted a paw and gently brushed against the tag, as if she recognized it. Henry's stomach tightened. He was a logical man. This didn't make sense. But deep in his gut, he knew. This wasn't just a stray cat. This was Daisy. Somehow, after all these years, she had found her way home. That night, Henry couldn't sleep. His mind raced, memories crashing over him like a tide. He saw Emily's tear-streaked face when Daisy had gone missing, heard the heartbreak in her voice as she searched for weeks, calling out into the woods, begging Daisy to come home. But the cat never returned. Emily had been devastated. Losing Daisy had been the final blow after her parents' divorce. A few months later, Emily's mother packed up their things and moved them away, cutting ties with Henry in the process. So much had been lost that year. Henry sighed and turned onto his side. Whiskers, or Daisy, was curled up on the pillow next to him, just like she had done when she was a kitten. The ache in his chest grew heavier. Was this a second chance? After all these years, Daisy had found her way back. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for Henry to bring Emily back too. The thought terrified him. What if she didn't want to hear from him? What if she had moved on? What if she still resented him for the way things had ended? Henry sighed, staring at the ceiling. As much as he feared the answer, he knew what he had to do. Tomorrow, he would try to find Emily. Henry woke up earlier than usual, the first rays of Montana sunlight creeping through his curtains. But today, his mind wasn't on his morning coffee or the birds outside. Today, he needed answers. Whiskers, or Daisy, lay curled at the foot of the bed, just as she had done the night before. Watching her sleep, Henry felt a strange mix of disbelief and certainty. Could this really be Emily's lost cat? There was only one way to find out. Henry pulled on his thick flannel jacket, scooped up Whiskers, and headed for his truck. The drive into town was quiet, except for the occasional meow of protest from the passenger seat. I know, Henry muttered, keeping one hand on the steering wheel. You hate the car. Just hold tight. The Willow Creek Veterinary Clinic was run by Dr. Marshall, a kind-hearted man in his late 40s who had been the town vet for as long as Henry could remember. When Henry walked through the door, Dr. Marshall raised an eyebrow. Well, now. Didn't expect to see you in here with a cat, he said with a chuckle. Henry sighed. Yeah, well, I didn't expect to be here either. He placed Whiskers on the examination table. I need you to check for a microchip. Dr. Marshall nodded and grabbed a small scanner. As he passed it over Whiskers' shoulder blades, the room fell silent. Then, a faint beep. Henry's breath caught. Dr. Marshall turned to his computer, typing in the code that appeared on the screen. Seconds later, he froze. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered. What? What is it? Henry asked, his voice tense. Dr. Marshall turned the monitor so Henry could see. Owner, Emily Lawson. Registered name, Daisy. Henry gripped the edge of the table. After 12 years, Daisy had come home. Henry sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the clinic parking lot. Daisy was Emily's cat. That meant one thing: he had no right to keep her. He swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel. It had been years since he last spoke to Emily. What if she didn't want to hear from him? What if she still blamed him for how things had turned out? He looked at Daisy, curled in the seat beside him, completely unaware of the emotional storm raging inside his chest. Fate had given him this moment. The question was, did he have the courage to take it? With a deep breath, Henry reached into his glove compartment and pulled out an old, faded letter. It was the last thing Emily had sent him, years ago, before she stopped writing. At the bottom of the page, her phone number was still there. Henry's hands trembled as he picked up his cell phone. He had lost Daisy once. He wasn't going to lose Emily too. With one last deep breath, he dialed. Henry's hands trembled as he stared at the phone. It had been years, too many years, since he had last spoken to Emily. He had no idea where she was now, what kind of life she had built, or if she even wanted to hear from him. But Daisy had come back. And maybe, just maybe, that meant Emily was supposed to come back, too. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the call button. The phone rang once. Twice. Henry's heart pounded. 3 times. Then, a click. Hello? It was her. For a moment, Henry couldn't speak. The voice on the other end was older, more mature, but there was no mistaking it. Emily. Hello, she repeated, her tone uncertain now. Henry cleared his throat. Emily, he hesitated. It's Grandpa. Silence. A long, heavy silence stretched between them, and Henry felt his stomach twist. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe she didn't want to. Grandpa. Her voice was softer now, but there was something else in it. A hesitation, an uncertainty, or was it hope? Henry swallowed hard. Yeah, sweetheart. It's me. More silence. Then a shaky breath. I haven't heard from you in so long, Emily said, and there was something fragile in her voice, something that made Henry feel the weight of all the years that had passed. I know, he admitted. I should have called sooner. He sighed, running a hand down his face. I wasn't sure you'd want to hear from me. Emily was quiet again. Then, softly, why are you calling now? Henry glanced at the seat next to him, where Daisy sat curled up, completely unaware of the moment unfolding. Well, he said carefully, I think I have someone here who belongs to you. Emily paused. What do you mean? Henry hesitated for only a second before saying the words that would change everything. I found Daisy. The line went completely silent. Henry's grip tightened on the phone. Emily? You still there? A shaky breath. Then, no, that's not possible. Emily's voice cracked. Daisy's been gone for 12 years. I know, Henry said. But she's here. She showed up on my porch a few weeks ago, and I took her in. I had the vet check for a microchip today. It's her, sweetheart. Another sharp inhale on the other end of the line. Then, a sob. Henry's heart clenched. I thought she was gone forever, Emily whispered. I looked everywhere. I never stopped looking. Henry closed his eyes, guilt washing over him. I should have called you sooner, he said softly. I should have told you as soon as she showed up. Emily sniffled. I don't understand. How could she find her way back? I don't know, Henry admitted. But she did. A long pause. Then Emily asked, hesitantly, "Can I see her?" Henry let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Of course, sweetheart. I'd love that." They spent the next few minutes making plans. Emily was 3 states away, living in Oregon now. She had a job, a life, but as soon as Henry mentioned Daisy, she didn't hesitate. "I'll come," she said, her voice stronger now. "I have to see her." Henry's throat felt tight. "Anne? Grandpa?" "Yeah, sweetheart." A pause. Then, softly, "I'd like to see you too." Henry closed his eyes. For the first time in years, something in his chest felt lighter. "Me too, sweetheart." As he ended the call, Henry looked at Daisy, who blinked up at him with those knowing green eyes. "Guess we're getting company, old girl," Daisy purred. And for the first time in years, Henry didn't feel alone. The old clock in Henry's living room ticked louder than usual. Or maybe it was just his nerves. He hadn't seen Emily in over a decade. He had spent the last few days trying to convince himself that she was still the little girl who used to run through his house with mismatched socks and wild laughter, but she wasn't. She was 22 now, a grown woman with a life of her own. What if she had changed too much? What if she barely recognized him? Or worse, what if she still resented him? Henry exhaled sharply and glanced down at Daisy, who was curled up on the armrest beside him. She had no idea what was coming, but Henry had a feeling she was about to change everything. A car pulled into the driveway. His breath caught. It was time. The front door creaked open. Henry stood frozen in the hallway, heart pounding. Then, she stepped inside. She was taller now, her long brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail, her face older, but her eyes, they were the same. Wide, filled with emotion, flickering with memories of a place she hadn't seen in years. Henry swallowed. "Hey, sweetheart." Emily blinked. For a second, she just stared at him. Then, her face crumpled. Henry barely had time to react before she stepped forward and hugged him. It wasn't just a polite hug, it was a fierce, desperate, years of lost time hug. The kind of hug that mended things neither of them had the courage to say out loud. Henry closed his eyes and wrapped his arms around her. "I've missed you, Em." Emily's voice was muffled against his shoulder. "I've missed you too." They stood like that for a long moment, the years between them melting away. Then, a soft meow. Emily stiffened and pulled back, her eyes darting toward the sound. Daisy stood at the top of the stairs, staring down at them. Emily let out a soft, shaky gasp. Henry watched as she took a step forward, then another. She didn't blink, didn't breathe. "Daisy," she whispered. At first, Daisy simply stared. Then, something in her shifted. With a sudden, eager movement, she leaped down the stairs and ran straight to Emily. Emily dropped to her knees, hands trembling as she reached for the cat. "Oh my God. Daisy, it's really you." Daisy rubbed her face against Emily's hands, purring so loud it filled the entire house. Emily let out a choked sob. She pressed her forehead against Daisy's, whispering through tears, "You came back. You found your way home." Henry turned away for a moment, blinking fast. He wasn't much for crying. But damn if this wasn't the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Emily wiped at her face, still cradling Daisy. "I don't understand," she murmured, voice thick with emotion. "How did she find her way back?" Henry shook his head. "I don't know, sweetheart. But I think she was meant to." Emily looked at him, really looked at him. "I think so too." They moved to the couch, Daisy curled in Emily's lap, and for the first time in years, they talked. About the past. About the things they never said. About how much they had missed each other. And as the evening wore on, Henry realized something. For the first time in a long time, his house didn't feel so empty anymore. The sun was beginning to set, casting golden light through the windows of Henry's small home. For the first time in years, the house felt full again. Emily sat cross-legged on the couch, gently stroking Daisy's soft gray fur, her eyes still glassy from tears. Daisy purred contentedly in her lap, kneading at Emily's jeans like she used to when she was a kitten. Henry sat across from them, his hands wrapped around a half-finished cup of coffee, watching them both with quiet gratitude. "So," Henry said, clearing his throat, "tell me about your life now." Emily looked up, smiling a little. "It's been a lot. I finished college last year. Got a job in Portland working with a publishing company." Henry raised an eyebrow. "A writer, huh?" Emily chuckled. "Not quite. I edit other people's work. But I love it." Henry nodded. "I always knew you'd do something creative. You used to make up all those wild stories when you were little." Emily smiled, and for a moment, she wasn't a grown woman, she was just a little girl again, sitting on his porch, telling him about the imaginary worlds in her head. She hesitated, then said softly, "I wanted to call you, Grandpa. So many times. But I didn't know if you wanted to hear from me." Henry felt a lump form in his throat. He set his cup down and leaned forward. "Oh, sweetheart," he murmured. "Not a day went by that I didn't think about you." Emily looked down, her fingers tightening in Daisy's fur. "I thought, after Mom and I left, that you were angry. That you didn't want to see me anymore." Henry swallowed hard, regret settling deep in his chest. "I was never angry at you, Emily. I was just stubborn. Too proud to reach out first." He exhaled. I should have called. I should have fought harder to keep you in my life." Emily met his gaze, and for the first time in years, Henry saw understanding there instead of distance. "Well," she said softly, "we're here now." Henry nodded. "Yeah. We are." Daisy meowed, as if reminding them that she was the reason they had found each other again. Emily let out a soft laugh. "I still can't believe she made it back to you." Henry smiled. Cats have a funny way of knowing where they belong. Emily looked at Daisy, then at Henry. "I think people do, too." The next morning, Emily stood by the front door, her bag slung over her shoulder. "I should probably head out," she said reluctantly. "I have to be back at work in a couple of days." Henry nodded, trying to ignore the ache in his chest. Emily bit her lip, then glanced down at Daisy. Would you want to come visit sometime?" Henry blinked. "You want me to visit?" Emily smiled. "Yeah. I think we have a lot of time to make up for." Henry felt warmth spread through his chest. "I'd like that, Em." She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him in another hug, not a goodbye, but a promise. And as Henry stood on the porch, watching her car disappear down the road, Daisy curled up at his feet, purring softly. He smiled to himself. For years, he had thought he had lost everything. But now, he realized, he had just been waiting to be found. Life has a mysterious way of bringing back what was once lost. Sometimes, it takes a lifetime to realize that the things we let go, whether it's a beloved pet, a family member, or a piece of ourselves, never truly disappear. They remain, waiting for the right moment to return. For Henry, the quiet solitude of his Montana home had become second nature. He had convinced himself that the past was just that, gone, untouchable, and best left alone. Yet, fate had other plans. When he found a small, scruffy cat on his doorstep, he never imagined that she was more than just a stray. For Emily, the pain of losing both her grandfather and her beloved cat, Daisy, had been a wound she carried for years. She had accepted that some things were simply lost forever until a single phone call proved her wrong. And for Daisy, the cat who had once been a small girl's best friend, the road home had been long and uncertain. Yet, against all odds, she found her way back, not just to Henry's house, but to the people who needed her the most. Through their journey, we are reminded of some of life's most powerful lessons. The power of fate and love. Some things in life are simply meant to be. Daisy's journey back home wasn't just a coincidence, it was fate. It was as if the universe knew that Henry and Emily needed a reason to reconnect, and Daisy became the bridge between them. Love has a way of finding its way back, even after years of silence. Whether it's between family members or an animal and its owner, some bonds are unbreakable, even by time. Just like Daisy found her way back, Henry and Emily found their way back to each other. Healing family wounds. For years, Henry and Emily had been separated by regret, misunderstandings, and silence. Neither had reached out, both afraid of reopening old wounds. But one phone call, a single moment of honesty, changed everything. Their story reminds us that it is never too late to mend broken relationships. We often assume that too much time has passed or that certain wounds can't be healed. But love is patient, and when we open our hearts, we realize that healing is always possible. A pet brought them back together, but it was their willingness to forgive that truly reunited them. Compassion for animals. Had Henry ignored the hungry stray cat outside his home that night, he never would have discovered that Daisy had been standing right in front of him all along. His act of kindness, offering a meal and a warm place to stay, changed everything. It's a reminder that small gestures of love toward animals can lead to unexpected miracles. Sometimes, rescuing an animal doesn't just save their life, it changes yours, too. Henry thought he was saving Daisy, but in the end, Daisy saved him. The bond between humans and animals. For Emily, Daisy wasn't just a cat, she was a symbol of home, of childhood, of a time when everything felt safe. Losing her was like losing a piece of herself. But Daisy's return proved that animals aren't just pets, they are emotional anchors. They connect us to our past, remind us of who we were, and sometimes, bring people together in ways we never expect. In the end, Daisy wasn't just Henry's cat. She was the missing piece that helped put their family back together. Forgiveness and second chances. Henry could have ignored the past. Emily could have refused to answer his call. But instead, they chose to let go of resentment and take a leap of faith. Life rarely gives us second chances, but when it does, we must be brave enough to take them. Henry and Emily's reunion wasn't just about Daisy, it was about making peace with the past and choosing to move forward. They had lost each other once. This time, they weren't going to make the same mistake. Time doesn't change true love. 12 years had passed, but Daisy still remembered. She still remembered Emily's scent. She still curled up in the same places she had as a kitten. She still found her way back to the family she loved. And just like that, Henry and Emily realized that love doesn't fade, it just waits. No matter how much time has passed, love remains. Whether it's a pet's devotion, a grandfather's love, or a granddaughter's longing, true love endures. A story that stays with us. When Henry first saw Whiskers on his porch, he thought he was just helping a stray. When Emily picked up her grandfather's call, she thought it was just about a missing pet. But it was never just about Daisy. It was about love, loss, time, and fate. And in the end, it was about finding their way back to each other, one paw print at a time.